That was entirely too long. I want to ask if the people in the back can hear, because there are times that I want to walk away from the podium, and if you can't hear when I do that, would you let me know? I have to stay with the podium for the recording. Daryl, can you hear me? Can you hear me now? All right. I'm very happy to be here today. Recently, a survey found that the average person's greatest fear was having to give a speech in public. Somehow this ranked even higher than fear of dying. And it made me wonder what was number two. And as a guest here in Kentucky, I thought maybe if I got on an elevator at the Brown Hotel and Rand, you know who, was on the elevator with Rachel, you know who, Maddow, that might be number two. Well, medicine has become one of the most powerful influences in the immediate past and current century. It dominates how we approach and think about another powerful phenomenon, the aging of the world's population, which is something all of us are concerned with today, especially those of us in medical school, but even more so those of us who are at that end of the spectrum. So that is my talk today. Part one of my objectives, we're going to look at visual and verbal storytellers. And I know that some of you know that humanities encompasses storytelling. That's what humanities is all about, storytelling. We tell stories as human beings, and people listen to our stories. So as physicians, you observe, you listen, you interpret, and then you wonder about that which wasn't expressed. But they provide insights about aging and the end-of-life chapters in the human journey. In part two of my talk, look at specific examples of aging and dying in the humanities perspective. And three, consider how aging and dying occurred previously, maybe 100 years ago, in the not-so-distant past, and then the changes that we currently experience. Anticipating deep autumn. That's a metaphor, of course. Autumn you think of as the end of the year. You also tend to think of that as the end of life. Deep autumn is when it's serious and you know that aging is very clear and that dying is maybe imminent. And how does humanity serve to complement that which you learn in the medical text? The medical text is very important, as all you students know. I teach first-year students and fourth-year students and some in between. But you really are attached by the umbilical cord to your medical text, aren't you? You're studying and memorizing and spitting it out. And maybe this doesn't seem relevant to you now, the idea of stories, but I think that by the time you're in the fourth year, and I know this because the fourth years come back and say, oh, that story you told, I saw that at Tampa General Hospital or at the VA, that was played out for me. But these stories can complement that which you are busy memorizing from the medical text. And then I'm going to show how age-related writings, the visual and the verbal, serve as a stimulus for meaningful reflection about stages of life that you, the young people here, have not experienced. How do they begin to prepare you for your parents and your grandparents and yourself as you age? Some of you may know the poet John Stone, poet-writer. He was at Emory for years. He died just a few years ago, John Stone. And these lines here, for you will learn to see most acutely out of the corner of your eye, to hear best with your inner ear. But there are late signs and early signs, for the patient's story will come to you. So observing and listening and waiting for that story to come, and you'll have lots of examples. Here is the symbol we use in our master's program and in the ethics humanities program for the young doctor putting other things into the study area, such as history and the arts, theater, so that the student complements that which he or she learns in the medical text with other disciplines. I really like this image here because all of us have grown up with once upon a time. Do you still hear me back there? Once upon a time. So once upon a time you left your house and you started out along the road and you got over to here. And typically in your fairy tales it was once upon a time and they lived happily ever after. Well, when there's a medical event, something occurs that brings that person to the health area, and that's the dark woods. And we all hope we get from here to there without incident, but obviously you wouldn't be going into medicine if there weren't things that happened in the woods. And the stories that we tell about those incidents are really important stories. And artists and writers with these tools, their visual and verbal tools that may begin with once upon a time or not, they are the storytellers, the record keepers of our journey from life to death. And think of your own journey. Some of you have had much longer journeys, and some of you are just beginning your journeys. And you will accumulate many more stories as you go along. I'm going to give you a painting now that I'd like you to talk to the person next to you and tell them the things that you see. What's the first overall impression of the painting? Talk to your neighbor, a dyad. What do you see here? You have no one to talk to. Talk to yourself. But so I can hear. What do you see in general? And then, as you move from the big picture, what small things do you see in this image? It is by Suzanne Valadon. She created this painting in 1921. And obviously, I put some big arrows there, so it's a duh moment. Okay, have you talked to the person next to you? So what might those little details tell you about what's going on in this picture?
Lois?
Yes. Okay. So what do the arrows point to that reveal information about the picture that you might not have looked at if I hadn't called your attention to? Although because you're in medicine, I suspect you are very attentive to details. Well, the first one, let's look up here. She's pubescent. There are two people, one is older and one is younger. So they're at two different points in the journey from birth to death. And the young girl may be developing breasts, but she still has a bow. Now, I'm not sure that my daughter, she's long past being a teenager, but that she would have wanted a bow in her hair when she was at that moment of development. So the bow looks a little iffy. Then we have the mirror. Mirror is perfect for a teenager. Always looking in the mirror, right? And how about the doll on the floor? You might have missed that. That's actually the name of the painting, The Abandoned Doll. I suspect that this girl might be interested in the mirror, in watching herself develop and grow, but she's not interested in the doll or the bow. Well, her mother sitting behind her, whoops, I might need some help back, the mother sitting behind her, according to Sharon Olds, who is a contemporary poet, when she looked at this, she decided that this story was about a mother looking at her daughter developing. And as the mother thinks about her life, her own life, she sees as a great difference. This young child is becoming, and she, the mother, is going. So Sharon Olds wrote a poem about while the eggs in her purse, her daughter's purse, are beginning to snap open, her own, the mother's, are becoming duds. There is a tremendous difference between the ages of these two people. Well, you don't expect in medicine for people to be talking about children this way. This is very unusual. But it is a story told, it is the story of a lifetime. It's a story, the universal story of aging. And it's presented this way in a verbal context that really sums it up if you want to take time to think about it. And it can complement everything that you learn in the textbook. Let's look at another example. Here's another narrative painting. This one is by someone named Cranach. And it was done in the 1500s. And again, see what you can observe about this painting. Here, here, and there. It moves from left to right, and it is called the Fountain of Youth, and all of us, we know that we have been obsessed, humans have been obsessed with the Fountain of Youth because it provides eternal life. Can you see that these are really old women on the left side? They go into the water, they're rejuvenated, and the young men, or men, come out to meet them. They're lovely women again. Well, that's ridiculous, isn't it? Although there are some things that go on today that make it seem less ridiculous. But that is the kind of odyssey that people have imagined could be possible, and we know that's not true. We probably wouldn't have a Florida if someone weren't hunting for the fountain of youth, hadn't been hunting. But that's preposterous that that could occur. And yet look how meticulous it is painted by Kranich. So that is a visual story of human dreams. Here are other pictures of the story of the journey from birth to death. The 7 ages of man or woman in the top case. And where do you see yourself? Probably just before the circle. I know that men are pictured in a different way. But there you have at the end, beginning of aging and then ending up with aging toward the end. And down below you have in pairs the same sort of thing, the 7 ages of man or woman. And there's a line from Shakespeare that you may know. All the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and entrances. And one man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages. So determine where you are on the life cycle and how you would want to see yourself pictured. I doubt that any of you want to see yourself like this, right? This is just another time. However, here's a later picture. This was done by Edvard Munch, M-U-N-C-H. Looks like Munch, but it's Munch, and you all know his painting, which one? Right, The Scream. So he's a familiar artist. Well, I want to ask the medical students where they are. The painting moves from left to right, and we know that because there are some visual signs that most of us are trained already to look at. The white on the left suggests an innocence, and over on the right you have a dark figure. Notice the one in white who's just greeting life, about to enter life, has her hands open, and the one on the right has the hands folded. And the people in the middle are dancing. I am definitely a little bit beyond, maybe way beyond the red toward the right. The medical students are somewhere between the white and the man in black, I would say, most of you. And then others are somewhere else along this scheme. But it's a way of looking at the seasons of life by Edvard Munch. Oh no, not yet. I'll go back to one more. Up. Well, we have one missing. Well, the one I wanted to show you by Klimt is, can you go back to that? No? Well, we'll just skip that. So here we have today, I used to have Britney Spears up, but my students said, she's passé. You have to put someone younger. So I showed this to my husband. He said, who's she? Which is great. My husband was clueless. But you know who she is. But just in case some don't. Who is it? Miley? Yeah. Okay. And then we have what might be a park bench down in St. Petersburg, Florida. And then we have the progress of life above. So this is another way of showing the same journey that I showed you a few minutes ago, more modern. This one here, where we have one television show matched against another television show. Those are the beginning of life and the end of life. Or this one here. Well, for some of you who don't know, Paul McCartney sang a song when he was very young, When I'm 64, and the probably impression is that I'll never get to be 64. That's really old. And he turned 64 maybe 3 years ago, and that was a moment, a really big moment. And we see Paul McCartney as a young man, and as he is now, and then we see what I kind of see as a miraculous portrayal of someone else when he was a young man, and now that he's much older. The red coat is probably needed for vim and vitality, and the red perhaps marks a symbolic note in the same way that Edvard Munch did, that that's the vitality of life, and maybe he's striving for that vitality of life again. But previously in the past, we want to see how life, aging and dying occurred, but especially dying. How many of you have seen The Seventh Seal by Ingmar Bergman? Not many, but some of you. That was a really important film. It was set in the time of plague, and you can see death taking the citizens of a village off toward death. And it's a very powerful movie. I really recommend that. And up above you see the old man sitting in the chair waiting for death to come along. Well, nobody, I mean, maybe some people do, but most of us don't wait for death to come along. We go to the doctor to see if something can intervene. So when there was nothing that could be done, people waited for death to occur. As a matter of fact, the church, especially in Europe, in our Eurocentric universe, dominated, and the spires pointed toward heaven as if to send the message that this is where you should be directed. And there was always a battle for the soul, good and evil, and the church certainly, many churches represent this, that you should aspire toward goodness and then you will be saved, called the psychomachia. And we still have that in existence today. Nothing ever goes away. There are still remnants or maybe large colonies of this kind of thought, but in general we've moved along. And a way of showing how death occurred in the past, we have paintings by really important artists who tell the story of dying in ways that are different than the story of dying today, which is the point of this presentation. I want to say that the artists are the record keepers, whether in writing or in story. They leave impressions so that we can understand the past and we can come to understand where we are today. And there are parts of the past we wish could be retained, maybe. For instance, the doctor in the painting on the left side is probably taking a pulse. The person perhaps is dying of diphtheria. And it may be a Catholic home. If you look at the painting and don't look for the details, you don't see any of that. You don't know it's diphtheria. But the time period, we know that there was a diphtheria epidemic, so scholars believe that it was for diphtheria. And the idea that it's a Catholic home seems to be possible. And people are always surprised that Pablo Picasso painted that, because most people are used to seeing Guernica or something that's been taken apart and reassembled. And this one looks like a real painting, like the kind of painting that is easier to see than trying to decipher through Guernica by Picasso. So he was certainly capable of doing that. And in fact, he had a sibling die of diphtheria, which is another reason to think that that's what he was painting. And the other doctor on the right side, this is a classic painting by Luke Fildis. And it was done in 1887. And there you have almost a magical picture of a physician. Most people who look at this really like this. This is old-timey doctor. This is great. This is symbolic of medicine. He's caring. He is thoughtful. The parents are at the side. The mother is weeping. And we can suspect that this child is not going to live because the doctor was unequipped to do anything for this child. Didn't have the medicines, didn't have the training. And while he certainly has all evidence of compassion, he doesn't have the tools that all of you have or will have in the future. But these represent another time. Another painting by Edvard Munch. Again, it's just a painting if you look at it quickly and move away. But if you study the painting and look for the details in the same way that you will with your patients when you go into a clinic visit, and you look for signs. How are they dressed? Who is accompanying this old person? How are they talking? Do they look well fed? What are the little signs that tell you something more that may actually solve the problem for which the person has presented? Here we have something called death in a sick room. Nobody's going to help this person because he or she has died. But there's one, people seem almost like statues in the room. They're standing, very formal. The person in the back has his hands up. Perhaps he's the minister. I mean, the posture that he's in suggests that possibly he is the pastor or the preacher or the minister who has been summoned. I don't know that there's a doctor there. I don't see any signs of a doctor, but I do see signs of medicine. You see it at the back table. And I don't know what happened to the person who has died. And we don't get all the answers. We never get all the answers, but that leads us to wonder. And to wonder about Does this picture represent anything that we have today? Well, yes, a lot of people want to die at home, and it may be similar to this. More people die in the hospital, so it won't be like this. And notice all of the family around. That's something a lot of people wish. They wish for family to be around. Others don't. We don't have all the answers. Well, I wanted to give you another poem, and this one's by Emily Dickinson, seen in the upper right-hand corner. And then you see kind of an Edward Gorey drawing, Masterpiece Theater kind of thing, of death and how death frightens children. And this poem that you're going to hear in a few minutes is set in maybe Amherst, Massachusetts, where Emily Dickinson lived. It's from a fearful child's perspective, fearful of death. Death has just occurred, and is told from a little boy's perspective when he's grown up. He thinks back. There's a hierarchy of importance. Think who's really important when you're sick. The doctor. The doctor is really important. And then when someone dies or is near death, the minister might become important, or the rabbi, or the imam. Worried about the soul. Remember we saw a picture of the soul? So it's still important. And then who's the person who's finally important? The undertaker, or the person who takes care of the remains. So let's look at this poem with these things in mind. There's been a death in the opposite house as lately as today. I know it by the numb look such houses have always. The neighbors wrestle in and out. The doctor drives away. A window opens like a pod, abrupt, mechanically. Somebody flings a mattress out. The children hurry by. They wonder if it died on that. I used to when a boy. The minister goes stiffly in as if the house were his, and he owned all the mourners now, and little boys besides. And then the milliner and the man of the appalling trade to take the measure of the house. There'll be that dark parade of tassels and of coaches. Soon, it's easy as a sign, the intuition of the news in just a country town. Well, the poem is a very modern poem for Emily Dickinson. She certainly doesn't have rhyme the way you might expect other poets of that time to have rhyme. But you notice the voice, the narrative voice, is that of a little boy, looking back, a man remembering when he was a child and how scary death was. And if you think back to your own childhood, was there a time when you noticed death in a hearse or a parade and it mattered to you and you had to ask your parents about that? I grew up in Massachusetts in a little town, and my mother told me one day somebody had died, a neighbor. I didn't know her, but she said, come up here. And I went to the upstairs, and she had me kneel down by the window, and we looked out and we saw a parade go by of mourners. And as a little child, I just couldn't, and then she told me about heaven and all kinds of things, but it has left such a lasting imprint on me for my mother to have told me what was going on in that. It was so dignified and respectful. I will always remember that. You don't see that much anymore. Maybe you do in Kentucky, but in Tampa you don't see that. If there's a funeral parade, people are honking, and it doesn't occur quite like that. Here is that same story told this way. You have the doctor going in and doing what the doctor does. You have the minister heading to the right. Then you have the preacher. Then you have the funeral procession. And then you have the funeral. So this is very different from what you learn about dying in the medical text. And I think it enhances that story because it's much more complex than just memorizing certain things about the actual physical occurrence of dying. All these family members are involved. All of these players, as it were, are involved, from the physician to the undertaker. Then there's a story that I want to talk to you about by Hemingway. We have Hemingway as a young man, middle-aged and older, and the story is a clean, well-lighted place. And it demonstrates the achievement of wisdom. Maybe as a young man, Phronesis, Hemingway may have jumped to conclusions about things, may have been dismissive of certain attitudes in the way that my kids are sometimes. But as he aged, he gained more wisdom. And I think all of us realize that wisdom really comes with experiences. And Hemingway really demonstrates this in one particular story, not just through experience, but through suffering. And you remember that he was part of World War I, and there was a great assault on human beings in general in World War I. And you people are part of an assault right now with the wars going on. and the kind of unrest we're experiencing. But we'll probably learn a great deal about that. But he wrote about the struggles in this bottom part. The reality of death. We're all going to lose, as it were, to death. All of us are going to die. But he presented a story where man dominated so that he didn't lose his dignity. And the story is this one: a clean, well-lighted place. And you have an old man. And an old man comes into a bodega every night. This old man, I used the Van Gogh painting here to show the old man. It's called, well, I've lost it. By Van Gogh. So you have two waiters. One is young and one is older. And the old man comes to the bar because it's a clean, well-lighted place. So he's somewhere in Spain. And remember, we have all of this stuff going on in the world, and Hemingway's depressed by what he's witnessed. So the young waiter is unhappy that the old man sits there for as long as he does. He's wasting his time. It's 11 o'clock. He wants to go home. The older waiter listens, and then he adds some information about the older man. He said, "Did you know that he tried to commit suicide a few weeks ago?" And the young waiter said he should have done so because old age is a nasty thing. And then when the old man asks for another drink, he calls for another drink. The younger waiter pours it over his hand very disrespectfully, so it pours over his hand and down the stem of the glass. The kinds of things that none of us would want to witness being done to an old man. And I want to read something to you. To the deaf man, the young waiter says, "You should have killed yourself last week," then adds that old age is a nasty thing. The old man responds to the waiter, even though the liquid is over his hand, "Thank you." In contrast, the older waiter is wiser and more patient. Unlike his colleague, this waiter seems to understand that the well-lighted cafe is a stand against darkness, a stand against loneliness and isolation, which is something that happens with the elderly, to stand against loneliness and isolation. So it's a very important story. It's only 2 pages long. And I always ask the medical students when I'm teaching this, and of course they've read it, how many of you honestly are like the younger waiter, that you're impatient? And I ask them in writing, and they don't have to put their name on it. And several, well, I'd say maybe out of 160 students, maybe 70 say, "I really don't want to admit this, but I'm probably more like the young waiter, but I'll probably be better as I get older, Dr. Nixon." And I think that might be true of some young people in this room, that when it's time to do something else, you want to do something else, and what's this old guy doing, just sitting there taking up my time? But as people in medicine, on the other hand, I would think that you have started thinking about these things already, and that this really matters. So it's a really important story that can help us understand aging. Another person, and all of you know this first line, "Do not go gentle into that good night" by Dylan Thomas, know that the poem that he wrote with that title was to his father. It was a subjective poem to his father with an imperative: do not go gentle into that good night. Even though his father was dying, he wanted him to rage against the dying of the light, to fight death. And of course, that happens today. We want to fight death. But there also is a new realization today that with some of the innovations that we have, the technology and the heroic medicines, maybe we don't all want to do that. So let's consider that for a minute. So the emerging voices appear in all of these different forms, and we'll look at some of them. 50. For some people, 50 is a huge age to achieve. Welcome to AARP, the prostate test, and don't you love the Cialis ads on TV? If you watch the news at 6 o'clock, you know, it's targeted toward aging people. If you watch Jon Stewart, I don't think Jon Stewart has Cialis ads, does he? Stephen Colbert? But all the news at 6 o'clock and 6:30 is aimed at people who are in the aging group, and so Cialis. And I always wonder why they're not in the same bathtub. And some other impressions of aging, some of them a little bit sad, but some of them wonderful. I mean, I hope that I can do a belly flop or whatever that is, like the man in the bathing cap, or have a loving relationship with my husband like the one in the center. But there are all kinds of impressions of aging. The ones that bother me most are the ones on the left, where you have two people who seem, the two people in the white, who seem left out. The vibrant colors are going on all around them, and they seem separated from that. And up above, a husband and wife who live in the same house but maybe don't speak to each other. That's always a very sad time. What is going on with the family dynamics? And part of aging is understanding that. On the other hand, that is over on the right. That's the way I'm going to be in just a few years, the woman with the purse and the hat. I'm heading that way. There is this poem by Jane Kenyon. She said of middle life, there is a moment in middle age when you grow bored, angered by your middling mind, afraid. That day burns hot and bright, making you more desolate. It happens subtly, as when a pear spoils from the inside out, and you may not be aware until things have gone too far. Well, all of you looked in the mirror. Young people less so, but older people look in the mirror and say, whoa, how did I get here? What happened? And it may be with weight, it just may be with changes. If you haven't seen your parents for a while and you go home, they have something to say, wow, you've changed your hair or whatever. Or you may notice some other things about them that have changed. Always be diplomatic. Don't burst out, blurt it out. Be careful. But it's nice when people write these things, because this isn't in the medical text, but she compares herself to a pear that's too ripe. And it seems very appropriate. If you had a whole lot of medical terms, it would seem less appropriate. Now here's a poem about hysterectomy. Don't look on the right, look on the left. That's about a hysterectomy and the kind of language that you might find in the medical text. Lucille Clifton wrote a poem to my uterus. Well, nobody talks about a uterus typically except physicians with their patients. Can you imagine? She's going to have a hysterectomy and she addresses her uterus. She says, "You uterus, you have been patient as a sock while I have slippered into you my dead and living children. Now they want to cut you out. Stocking I will not need where I am going. Where am I going, old girl, without you, uterus? My bloody print, my estrogen kitchen, my black bag of desire. Where can I go? Where can I go, and where can you go without me?" Well, this was illustrated by medical students, and they got right in the oven. You notice that she's an oven, and her reproductive oven is babies, love, sexuality, and fertility. And for most of us, it's a very amusing poem, because we don't think in the medical world of our uterus as a bloody print, but we all know what that means on airplanes or elsewhere. My estrogen kitchen, I mean, who ever thought of estrogen kitchen? And my black bag of desire. So this is very unusual. But your patients have voices. Your patients are thinking. You're a thinking person, so you have that subjective side where you can learn all the things you have to learn in a text. You can look at someone and study it, but as soon as someone speaks up, you never know what they're going to say. And here is a woman that is talking about her uterus in a very unusual way, the uterus which she won't have tomorrow after her hysterectomy. So now we're going to shift to deep autumn, serious illness and dying, from multiple perspectives, and a poem by David Rinaldi. Notice the next two poems by physicians. So physicians are subjective. They have stories. They're thinking about things. They're just not inside the white coat. And it talks about simultaneity, multiple things going on at once. For instance, you're wondering how long I'm going to talk. You're wondering what's going to happen next. What about dinner tonight? How about a date? The test that's coming up, whatever. So you're in an informational age setting with lots of noise going on around you and things. When he wrote this poem, Jack Kevorkian was very much in the news, so as he was running down the hallway, this doctor, he could hear things about Jack Kevorkian, so that kind of registered in his ears. He thought of the rest of the news as circus and tragedy, thought about ethics and the Hippocratic Oath. Then he thinks about his father and his father's wife, so there's a hint there that it's maybe a stepmother. Drug intervention. As a doctor, what could I do to help my father? Then the distance between them. One lives perhaps in New York and one lives in Tennessee, I think. Then the Hippocratic Oath, and so I waited. I didn't do anything. But here's the poem. In the first The title is the first line of the poem. Let's talk about it, as in death panels, maybe, or just in conversations between doctors and patients. Let's talk about the things that we are uncomfortable typically about talking about. With all the talk about Dr. Death, Kevorkian, news bites sandwiched between circus and tragedy, hesitantly I say, in my confusion, I understand him, but still, as a physician, morally and ethically, and yet, and surreptitiously, remember how very secretly I thought how Dad's castrated body lay crooked in his sweaty Tennessee cot, his wife's terminal phone voice, drawling out the daily news, how very secretly I calculated how many of those little painkillers it might take, and silently remembered how I put it all out of my Hippocratic mind, and yet felt ashamed for weakness, and so I waited. So you have a doctor thinking about all these things at once, as all of us do. We have this sense of simultaneity. We have all these forces and all this information coming at us, and we always have our family's well-being somewhere in our mind. And here's someone who has a sick father, and he's thinking about this. Well, this is fiction for all I know. I have no idea whether it's real or fiction, but we have a physician who's thought about things in the way that many physicians feel about things. So this is kind of in the tradition of William Carlos Williams and Mikhail Bulgakov, physician writers who express how they're feeling. They're just not behind their white coat. And this is fairly new. Another physician, John Mukan, who's been at Brown, and he has a story, Lullaby. Lullaby typically means babies, mothers singing babies to sleep. Now listen how different this story is. And the students put the illustrations in for me. It's from a physician's perspective. I'm not sure it's John Mukan. He just wrote the poem. Whether it's his story or not, I don't know. But it is a physician speaking. Each morning, I finish my coffee and climb the stairs to the charts, hoping yours will be filed away. But you can't hear me. You can't see yourself clamped between this hard plastic binder, lab reports and nurses' notes, a sample and a test tube. I keep reading these terse comments. Stable as before, urine output still poor, respiration normal. And you keep on poisoning yourself. Your kidneys more useless than sea wings, drenched in an oil spill. I find my way to your room and lean over the bed rails as though I can understand your wheezed out fragments. What can I do but check your tubes, feel your pulse, listen to the heartbeat, insistent as a spoiled child who goes on begging? Old man, listen to me. In this part, I think, these 6 lines of the lullaby. Let me take you in a wheelchair to the back room of the records office. Let me lift you in my arms and lay you down in the cradle of a clean manila folder. Well, all of you are involved in ethics classes, and you have to say, is he thinking what I'm thinking? No, I don't think he's thinking of terminating this patient in any way, but he is understanding futility and talking about futility. And all of you see futility, but we don't talk about it in this way. So here you have a physician who sat down and thought about some of the things he does on a day-to-day basis, well, hopefully not day-to-day, but things that aren't uncommon to physicians. And he talks about it this way. And I think that most of us appreciate the fact that life is very different. This patient is intubated. The quality of life is probably non-existent, and he is describing what he sees. But you also get a sense that this is a very caring person. And the file cabinet that has the slide that comes in and out is probably the cradle, and the empty folder will go in, or the minimalized folder will go in. John Mukan is about 40, and he's a very good speaker. He's come to our school a couple of times. Now I want to call your attention. I will promise before I end I'll turn it to something a little lighter. I took out some things. But this is the Inferno by Dante. And you know, you never want to go down to the bottom because that's the 10th circle. That's the worst, the very worst. And all kinds of unimaginable things happen to you if you get down to the 10th circle. So Paul Zimmer, who's not a physician, wrote this poem about his father. His father lives in a building that has this sign on it in an assisted living. More than 3 health emergency calls in 1 month from apartment to switchboard shall be conclusive evidence to the landlord that the occupant is not capable of independent living. The landlord can then have the tenant move to such a health care facility as is available. Well, the son is very nervous about that. And he says to his dad, "Dear Dad, do not fall for the 3rd time, or if you do, tell no one. Hunch over your agony and make it your ultimate secret. You have done this before. Shrug, tell a joke, go on. If an ambulance slips up quietly to the back door, do not get on. They mean to take you to the 10th circle, where everyone is turned in one direction, piled like cordwood inside the cranium of Satan, so that only the light of television shines in their eyes. Dad, call if you need help, but don't let them take you easily to this place where they keep the motor idling on the long black car, where if someone cries out at night, only the janitor comes. Love, Paul." Well, my students say, first of all, why isn't the son there? Why is he writing him this letter? We don't know what the circumstances are, but this is the kind of thing that would catch my attention. If I saw that sign on a wall, I would worry about my dad being transported to a care facility that he might not be able to leave at some point. So that's, I think, the last of my most depressing things. But I did want to call your attention to some depressing films. Savages. If you haven't seen Savages, you should. How many of you have seen it? 1. Boy, you see everything. Are you a medical student? No. No, okay. And the medical students don't have time yet, right? What? Oh, okay. This is Laura Linney and Philip Seymour Hoffman. Great film about it's about people who don't think about end of life, and then what happens when it suddenly and abruptly occurs. Away from Her with Julie Christie. We all love Julie Christie. We older people who know who Julie Christie is. She has Alzheimer's in this film. So that's a story, one of these verbal, visual performances. Over on the right at the bottom, The Sea Inside, about a man who for 30 years lives with a severe spinal injury. He cannot move, and it's about the struggle he has in Spain and trying to get autonomy. And I put Driving Miss Daisy because I think all of us think that's a really good story. We all know it, we like it, but it's a story about moving from where she's old to being much older and her relationship with her driver. And I would suggest that movies help us to think away from the medical text, that they help us by complementing with bigger stories. Now I'm going to show you just a few minutes of a story of some old women who get lost. Their bus breaks down. The driver of the bus, the woman in the red headband, injures her leg. When it opens, it's being fixed by one of the older women who's an Indian. And they are out in the woods. They're very vulnerable, and they have to survive on their own. So here's the story. They come out of the shadows. As you hear little voices. They could be Girl Scouts, but they're not. They're very frail old ladies.
Something completely unexpected.
Can you hear it? Can you hear it? Can I turn it up?
Speakers, you can't hear, just do this thing.
Okay. You see, they're way out in the wilderness. How are they possibly going to survive? All right, it goes on. And I'll end with just 3 slides here. One is John Stone, who was visiting his mother. She was in a nursing home. John was about 65. And he says of his mother, "I dropped in on my mother, dazzling in her yellow sweater. I sat down at her table. I'd seen her 2 days ago. But this time I startled her, I think too early in the week, for another visit. 'You just appeared out of nowhere,' she said, then asked me, smiling, 'Where have you been doing all these years?'" It's the very same question I've been asking myself, which I think is a very profound thought. How much do you invest in life? How much do you listen and observe and imagine? So in medicine, we have the ability to shut ourselves off to focus only on our medicine, or we have the ability to read the patient very carefully and pay attention through films, through literature, through music, and through art to see a very different story. And John Stone, again, "For there will be the arts, and some will call them soft data, whereas in fact they are the hard data by which our lives are lived." I can answer some questions. Oh, wait, one joke story. The best part, right? All right. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer questions.
Now, and just remind you too, the entire presentation will be on not only the Division of Medical Students and Medicine's website, but also at iTunes University at the Apple Store, iTunes Store. Do you have any questions for Dr. Nixon?
I really love what I do, working and finding materials for students. It's everywhere. You cannot turn around. Walking through the bookstores, and I had a pumpkin cookie yesterday in Borders, and the number of books I found, I'm always seeking for pictures. I see something and I want to include it in the next lecture. Human beings are so interesting, and how they are described by other human beings are so interesting. And if we fail to look at those things and think about them, I think that we're losing out on those interpretations. David?
Repeat questions when they're asked.
Okay.
If you could explain the biggest challenge from your experience in presenting to medical learners, whether it's medical students or residents,
right,
using such movies.
What is the biggest challenge? Well, in the first year is the biggest challenge. It's required in the first year, has been for years. And I've been doing this for 2 decades now. And the medical students frequently say in very harsh evaluations that stun me, because I can't believe they're physicians to be that they would say something so harsh. What does she know? What is she talking about? This is a waste of time. If I wanted to study literature, I would be over on the other side of campus. However, what happens is the students, I'm a very friendly person. I see the students through all 4 years. And the elective in the 4th year, it has been in years past that I've had as many as 60 students sign up for a 4th year elective, and I just don't have space for it. So now they're limited to 30. And the students come back, and in the 4th year, the students are really quite different. And so many of them will say, you know, you said I'd be back in the 4th year for an elective, and I thought to myself, what is that woman smoking? I'll never be with her again. And here I am, Dr. Nixon, and I was one of the ones who gave you the most grief. But in the 4th year, something has happened. That phronesis that I was talking about, that experience, that wisdom that comes from being a clerk in the clerkship, makes them think a little bit more. They also start thinking about their families, I think. When they go home at Thanksgiving this time of the year, they hear news about family members that connects them with something different from the medical text. And that's really important. All of those little episodes in their life that give them more connection with other human beings, I think makes them non-medical students, the intensity of the medical experience, it moves them away from it.
I have a question, and I guess it might take a while to get out. I think that I've noticed the same thing that you're noticing, that a lot of the students come into medical school, and they just seem very bitter. When you mentioned in that one letter from the son to the father about not calling in his apartment, it was not surprising that medical students would all of a sudden say, well, where's your son? Why isn't he taking care of his dad? And there's just a lot of harsh judgments passed on patients and their families that I see. And I wonder if part of it is that in the pre-medical curriculum that we're so invested in teaching science, and that we're kind of telling them the importance of categorizing people. And so we have to lump people into categories in order to analyze them and figure out what's going on. And that perhaps, places at the East Coast have it right, that say we don't really necessarily need to take people who have such a heavy basic science curriculum into medical school, and maybe the humanities should be a lot more of the pre-medical curriculum than it currently is. And I wonder what you thought about that.
She just summed up the whole lecture. That was great. She said that the question was, or the observation was, that when students come into medical school, there is such a strong focus on the sciences that some of the humanities' interest might be stripped away, that which is innate in the medical student. And I do think it is in most medical students innate, but because of that intensity and because of that first exam when it comes along, and that inward toward medical school thrust of the medical student, they push that aside. And later when they become more comfortable, and we are trying to create more comfortable environments, having groups and doing training in a different way, that it may be occurring sooner than the 4th year, but I definitely see that evolution. As far as humanities, I think it should be an integrated part. I don't mean that it has to be integrated into all of the courses, because I can't go in all the courses and do diabetes. I don't dance on a table and do a diabetes poem. But I think there is something about the personality and the passion of a humanities professor that says, this is a way of living, and make sure you're taking care of yourself, and make sure we faculty who have you in our hands are taking care of you. And we demonstrate caring for the patient by caring for the medical students. I really believe that. And I think that makes a difference. When you pay attention, when you smile at them, say hello, what a difference that makes with dealing with medical students. It's very tough when some faculty person says, well, that is a waste. I mean, that's the worst thing that can happen, when the ethics or humanities is dismissed by a faculty person. Because the medical student realizes that let's get on to the biochemistry. But still that student may come back and realize, we certainly hope everybody who's in medical school has some turn toward ethics and humanities big time, but maybe at a later date. But in the first year, I'm glad I'm there, because it introduces them. So they either are very angry that I'm there, or they say, oh, this is the best part, but I have to study my other stuff. So it introduces them, and they'll come back in the 4th year, maybe. Yes. Hi,
Well,
Steve.
one of the things that we've encountered is a similar kind of response to ethics lectures from students, not so much these last years, but certainly early on. And we sort of have the same sort of reaction. Wait till you're in your third year, you start seeing
know.
Why do we wait? What are your thoughts about maybe a medical school curriculum that included, sure, the ethics and humanities, but also patient contact in the very first year? Why do we have to wait 2 years in order to get them to realize the value of this?
Well, actually, he asked why do we have to wait for that patient contact until the third year. In our school, this year we have a new curriculum, and we do have the students with patients in the first year. It's just started. I'm not sure how it's going to sort out, so I'll report back next year. But we are doing that, and I think that is something to consider. We also have a master's program, and I was telling Dr. Dukas about that the students who come in, remember all the medical students have worked forever to get into medical school, and they're there. So they can be decisive about their pronouncements. The students in the master's program want to go to medical school. They want to be docs. They hang on my every word. It's just amazing. It's almost scary, like, because I know in another year when they get into medical school, they'll be different, maybe. And of course, some medical students love humanities and love ethics, probably the majority. But those 20% that write these really awful, awful, awful evaluations, I just wonder, what are they going to write about patients? Especially when someone is as kind and compassionate as I know. You just wonder, yes.
There's a CEO of the University of Rochester who's a physician.
Who's a what?
Who's a physician.
Yes.
And he had a bicycle accident. And of course he was taken care of in the ICU for several months. And he didn't understand, up to the time he was a patient, what caring is all about. Isn't that a little bit too late, to realize that people care for you, and you're already a physician and a CEO?
Yes. He said that there was a physician who was in a bicycle accident. We know someone who was in a bicycle accident just recently. And at that point discovered what compassion was all about. We do show them at least part of the film, The Doctor, with William Hurt. You all know that, where he has an illness episode and becomes a patient. We try to find stories like that to show them. But obviously that phronesis, that experiencing suffering yourself, that probably makes you wiser. But on the other hand, I think that if you are a caring person and you're going into medicine for all the right reasons and you observe suffering, you should pick it up before you have an illness. Otherwise, why are you in medical school? It's kind of like going to a cheese shop and asking for steak. Well, it's a cheese shop. You come to medicine because you're suffering and you need care, and not because of something else. Any other comments? Well, if you find any things that you want to send me along the way, please, I'm always trying to enhance. And probably the people that are here, let me just show you a couple things, unless you've already. On the outtakes, things I took out. To connect with ethics. Funny we don't feel old, isn't that right? That's a truism. Or this one, the painful decisions that you make toward the end of life. Or how a medical student feels. This student drew a picture of how she felt after the second week of medical school. Isn't that something? These I thought might not go over too well. Or this one. That was too grim. My students said. And then a poem to my last period by Lucille Clifton. All the students have gone. Well, girl, goodbye. After 38 years, and you never arrived splendid in your red dress without trouble for me somewhere, somehow. Now it is done. I feel just like the grandmothers who, after the hussy has gone, sit holding her photograph and sighing, wasn't she beautiful, wasn't she beautiful? Well, I have my students do drawings. This is Ivan Ilyich at the end of his life. And then that's enough. Thank you.